Hi guys, in class we talked about characteristic properties. I defined a characteristic property as any property that's useful for identifying a substance or separating it from a mixture. So right now we're focused on identifying substances, and we talked in class about the fact that lots of things have similar properties to one another at first glance, and what properties can we actually look to determine or distinguish one substance from another. So it's helpful to have a picture of a substance to get us started here. If you needed to describe this piece of metal that I've just popped a picture of into the frame, you would probably start out by saying, well, it's silvery, or it's shiny, or you might say it's rectangular. And then you would sort of run out of things to talk about just by looking at it, so you might pick it up in your hand and say, it doesn't weigh very much, it's very light. Or you might actually go ahead and measure its volume, or you might find its mass to figure out exactly how much it weighs. And all of those things would be what we call general properties. So things like color, or luster, which is how shiny you are, or shape, which is the rectangularness, or even mass or volume, are all things that don't really help you identify the substance. Now, every once in a while, and we talked about this in class, there'll be some substance that has a very distinctive color, and so just looking at it can kind of give it away. Like, for example, copper is a very obvious looking metal, and usually when people see copper, they know right away that it's copper. But typically that is not the case, and so usually these properties that I have over here on the left are properties that, yeah, they're useful, but they're not useful enough that we could say we know for sure what metal we have. I know what color this is, I know how shiny it is, I know what shape it's in, I could find its mass, I could find its volume, but none of that's going to help me identify it. However, I can take the mass and volume together and find the ratio of one to the other, because that would give me a characteristic property called density. Density is how much mass is crammed into a certain amount of volume. And that varies by substance because that's determined by how close together the particles are, which depends on how much interparticle attraction they have. So every substance has, if not a unique density, a close to unique density. So you might find lots of substances that have overlapping or near each other densities, but it's rare that you're going to find a whole bunch of them. So if you know the density of a substance, it's going to really narrow things down for you. To get density, though, you have to measure both mass and volume. And that can be tricky to do when you have a small amount of something, which is what I was working on showing you in class. I was showing you how hard it can be to find the volume of a small amount of metal in a little graduated cylinder. And you can watch a tutorial that shows you all the pitfalls and the things that you want to do if you're trying to do that. All right, well, besides density, what other properties might you find useful in identifying a substance? I'm going to list them, and then we'll talk about each one by one. It turns out that substances typically have unique or nearly unique melting points. Oops, I wanted to make that in melting point. Sorry about that. And substances also have, not surprisingly, unique or fairly unique boiling points. Same thing. Because again, just like with density, your melting point and boiling point have to do with how attracted the particles to each other. So the amount of heat energy it takes to make your particles go from the solid to the liquid state or from the liquid to the gas state is very characteristic. It depends totally on what you're made of. So knowing at what temperature something melts or boils can be very useful in identifying it. Also, solubility. Solubility is how well something dissolves. And notice I'm not specifying what the liquid is we're doing the dissolving in. Usually it's water, but it doesn't have to be. Some substances don't dissolve very much in water, others dissolve really, really well in water. And you can actually calculate the exact amount of a substance that will dissolve at a certain temperature in a certain amount of water. And you can use that number to compare the substance to other substances. Solubility is a pretty unique measure. Now, if you're not going to actually get the actual number of grams that are dissolved, you can just kind of use solubility to get a general idea. Hey, does this thing dissolve in water? Does it dissolve in alcohol? What does it dissolve in? What doesn't it dissolve in? And that can be useful information too. Another really cool characteristic property that you guys are going to check out is something called spectra. Spectra is the singular version of the word spectrum. A spectrum is a rainbow, and spectra refers to the color of light that's given off in a flame by a particular chemical. Chemicals give off different colors of light in a flame because they're turning to a plasma, which is that state of matter that gives off light. And the colors of light are very distinctive. This is, in fact, how we know what gases make up the sun, by looking at the sun through a special device that breaks the colors of light up into individual lines. We can tell what gases are being burned and turned to a plasma in the sun by those colors of line. It's pretty interesting. And then finally, the last characteristic property that we're going to look at that's a physical property. All of these things are physical properties, right? I can find density, melting point, boiling point, solubility, spectra, color, luster, shape, mass, and volume. All of those things can be found without turning this into a new substance, right? The last one I want to add is something called specific heat capacity. Specific heat. I'm going to run out of room for the word capacity, so I'll just abbreviate it capacity. Specific heat capacity is a measure of how much heat energy is needed to make the molecules in something speed up 1 degree Celsius. So if you think of temperature as a speed, which I've encouraged you to do, if you want to know how much energy it takes to make the molecules gain 1 degree of temperature, make them speed up that much, that is the specific heat capacity of the substance. Now that may sound like a weird thing to use as a characteristic property, but it works really well. Think of it this way. Typically, if you're cooking on the stove, you're not going to usually use a metal spoon for stirring something really hot. You can, but it's not recommended. Why? Because metal spoons heat up really fast. You put a metal spoon in hot water and pretty soon the spoon itself is pretty hot. Instead, I would recommend using a wooden spoon for that because wood does not heat up very fast. How quickly something absorbs heat energy is what specific heat capacity is. And you can actually measure that. Different metals have different specific heat capacities, and that's a really good way to tell one metal from another because they vary so much. And I'll actually teach you a technique for figuring out the specific heat capacity of your unknown metal that you'll be working with. So those are all the physical properties. All chemical properties are characteristic properties. I'm just going to add chemical properties up here, and we'll say reactivity is how we'll define them. What do you react with? Reactivity is a characteristic property. Knowing what substances react chemically with a particular substance will help you determine what it is. So for example, if this sample here was aluminum, we know that aluminum reacts with copper sulfate to produce aluminum sulfate, which is sort of a grayish liquid, and copper, which will fall to the bottom or coat our aluminum. So that's a really good way to identify a metal, is by seeing what does it chemically react with. And again, I'm going to give you individual tutorials that show you how to find all of these things. So the general properties are things I expect you already can figure out. You can probably figure out how colorful or lustrous your object is. You can tell me what shape it has. You can find mass and volume pretty accurately right now. But the rest of these things you might need some help with. Finding out the specific heat of your substance, looking at spectra, finding solubility, looking at boiling and melting point, density. We've done a few times, but you still may need some help with that. And doing tests of different reactivities with different chemicals, those are all tests that you're going to want to run in the lab that you're going to do. Because I'm going to give you a piece of metal, and I'm going to say to you, figure out what it is. And you're going to run all these different tests. So some of them are going to be things that you've done before, and some of them are going to be things that are kind of new to you. But that's okay, so you're going to learn by doing them. And eventually you'll get enough characteristic properties together that you're going to feel pretty confident that you know what your metal is. And then your job's going to be, as a group, to present the evidence you have about what your metal might be to the class. Part of that evidence will be talking about how you ran your lab procedures so that we can decide whether or not we trust what you actually did, whether or not it's actually valid. So that's the lesson on characteristic properties. I will see you guys in lab.